Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Positive Energy virtual conference on the roles and responsibilities of public authorities in energy decision-making in an age of climate change. I'm delighted that you all can join us. It's a terrific audience today. I've seen a copy of the registration list. We've got some great leaders from across the country with us today. My name is Monica Gattinger. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa, and I'm founding chair of Positive Energy. For those who aren't familiar with Positive Energy, our mandate is to identify how to strengthen public confidence in decision-making for issues around energy in a context of climate change. The way we pursue this mandate is twofold. The first of which is to use the convening power of the university to bring leaders together from business, from government, from Indigenous communities, from ENGOs, from the academy, to identify what the key issues are when it comes to public confidence. And then I have the privilege of leading a research team of academics and senior practitioners who undertake solution-focused applied academic research. I'd like to begin our session today with a land acknowledgement, and I encourage you all to acknowledge the land from which you are joining us. This land acknowledgement is especially important today, as all days, as we mourn the lives of the 215 children whose remains were found at a former Indian residential school in British Columbia. Our hearts are with the families, the survivors, and all of those who have been damaged by the Indian residential school system. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada, who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Again, I would encourage you to acknowledge the land from which you are joining us today. Today is the first of 4 days of lunch hour sessions profiling positive energy research on public confidence and the roles and responsibilities of public authorities in energy decision-making. It can seem like academic stuff, but it's far from it. Who decides what, when, and how for energy and climate decisions, whether it's policy decisions, regulatory decisions, project decisions? It's absolutely crucial. There are multiple public authorities involved in decision-making: policymakers, regulators, the courts, Indigenous governments, municipal governments, federal, provincial, and territorial governments, and the list goes on. And for Canada, a resource-intensive economy with a large energy endowment, having decision-making arrangements for the country's energy and climate future that secure the confidence of citizens, customers, communities, investors, even governments, is crucial. It will shape how well Canada will succeed on both energy and climate, and all the more so on the road to net zero emissions by 2050. When it comes to net zero, policy debates often focus on technologies and energy sources, both of which are admittedly crucial. But policy debates often overlook the institutional arrangements that will be needed to reduce emissions in the real worlds of politics, intergovernmental relations, consumers, energy markets, investors, citizens, and community preferences. Positive Energy's work on roles and responsibilities is intended to fill that gap, and you're going to be hearing about it over the course of the next 4 days. Today, we are honored to kick off the conference with a keynote from Nik Nanos, Chair and CEO of Nanos Research. Nik is also the chair of the Positive Energy Advisory Council, and Nanos is the official pollster of Positive Energy. Nik's going to be presenting a survey that we are just releasing today about public confidence in energy and climate decision-making. Some of the questions are tracking questions, so we've actually got data going back to 2015, as you're going to see, and others are new questions. Without giving too much away, I think what I can say is that the results underscore that governments continue to have a lot of work to do to strengthen public trust in decision-making. So Nik's going to give a brief presentation. We're going to follow that with a Q&A. In terms of the question and answer session, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to pose your questions. If you'd like me to mention your name, let me know by including that in your question. And feel free to type in your questions as Nik's presenting. I won't interrupt his presentation with questions, but we will get to them once he's finished with his presentation. So Nik, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Monica, and hello, everyone. I'm quite looking forward to sharing the latest data that we've collected on behalf of Positive Energy. I'm assuming right now that everyone can see my shared screen where I get to walk through the numbers. I would also like to say that if you visit the Positive Energy website, you'll be able to access all the, I'll call it the, not to sound too technical, oodles of stats that go into a lot of detail on what different subpopulations think about the issues that we decided to unpack in this wave of research. And as Monica mentioned, the interesting thing about this particular wave is that it includes a combination of tracking variables so that we can see the shifts in opinion over time, and also in the true positive energy fashion, there were new ideas and new things that we wanted to test and unpack. And for the purposes of my quick chat today, I'm going to do a bit of a walk through the perception that Canadians have of the job on environmental and energy issues. We're going to also dip into views on federal and provincial cooperation. And I don't even want to call it a bonus, but this is new and quite substantive and very interesting, brand new data on the perceptions that Canadians have of the courts when it comes to settling disputes on both environmental issues and also on energy projects. And there's some very interesting data that we have on that particular front. And just as a bit of a, I have to give the disclaimer. It's not even a disclaimer, kind of like the technical note. So the opinions that I'm kind of putting on the table now are based on a national survey that was completed on May the 3rd. It's accurate plus or minus 3.1 percentage points, 19 times out of 20. And if you're a real techno geek, there's a technical note for you in the back on how the sampling worked and all the questions and all of that kind of stuff. But let's start off with some top line numbers where we're kind of stacking up a number of different dimensions where basically we ask Canadians to provide a report card. How good or poor a job are we doing as a country on a full range of issues? And you can see having environmental policies, building constructive partnerships with Indigenous peoples, all the way down to building public confidence in energy decision making. And the key takeaway, as Monica kind of gave you a little bit of a heads up in her opening remarks, but the key takeaway here, not a lot of green on the board for any of these. You can see when it comes at the bottom of the grid, the least amount of confidence had to do with issues related to energy decision making, where you can see only about 13% of Canadians scored that a very good or good. And when the bar is so small, that means that just there's so few Canadians. Even at the top of the grid, having environmental policies which align with the views of Canadians, that was the strongest score. But even on that front, it's still, you can see net negative. And for those of you that are wondering what the net scores are on the right-hand side, basically that's the difference between positive scores and negative scores. And the key takeaway here, when it comes to the job that Canadians believe that we're doing on a full range of issues, it doesn't matter how you cut it, what you test, that the key takeaway when you ask average Canadians is that they still believe that we're likely to do more of a negative than a positive job on this. And it speaks to what was mentioned in the opening remarks. There's still significant opportunity for improvement right across the board. But let's take a moment and kind of unpack some of the tracking numbers on this. And what's interesting is that when we look at our first benchmark wave in 2015, when we asked Canadians about having policies which align with the views of Canadians, the positive news, although the score is still net negative, that level of negativity in terms of the disconnect between Canadians and the environmental policies that they see is a little less. You know, you can see back in 2015, about 16% scored us a good or very good job, and that's increased to about 1 out of every 4 Canadians. And you know, the other interesting thing is back in 2015, that was at the tail end of the Harper administration. What you can see at least is that at least over time, there seems to be an incremental pattern. You know, it's not gangbusters, it's not a rocket trend line, but it is kind of an incremental movement. The other thing is that for those Canadians that thought back in 2015 that there was a fundamental disconnect, and you can see that score where 35% scored a very poor job at connecting the views of Canadians with our environmental policies, and another 26, that level of disagreement with that statement and that intensity of disagreement has significantly dropped. So not great scores, but better when we look at the long-term trend. And the other thing is there's a significant difference of opinion. We know this from past research that we've done and the body of knowledge that's out there. And we saw this same thread now, is you can see residents in the prairies are more likely to score. You can see 53% saying we do a poor or very poor job compared to individuals in Quebec. So we did see a bit of positive movement on that particular measure, but when it comes to balancing the concerns of local communities that are affected by local infrastructure projects with the broader regional, provincial, and national interests, no real change over the last number of years. And you know, this is interesting because you know what we know is that for things to happen, there needs to be, I'll call it, local license. And also there needs to be a vision on how things fit in with what I'll say the national priorities, regional priorities, provincial priorities. And you know, compared to the other measure where there has been some incremental improvement, we can see that the score for all intents and purposes, factoring the margin of error, has basically been within the same band when it comes to that particular local dimension. And you know, we can see in terms of a long-term vision, even though the whole issue of Canada's energy future has been a central plank, not just of this government, but of previous governments, there hasn't really been significant improvement or a significant kind of greater sense that we're making headway at articulating some sort of long-term vision for Canada's energy future. I think it would be fair to say that for average Canadians, when they think about this, they think of incidents, specific projects, short-term issues that need to be managed, and that this whole concept of more of a long-term vision and a long-term strategy for our energy future has not really been front and center among Canadians, and that they are, you know, for all intents and purposes, if you look at the numbers back in 2017 when we first asked this measure, the numbers are very similar between 2017 and 2021. So it's not even 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. It's kind of like no steps. We're still in the same place that we were back in 2017 on this particular measure. When it comes to building confidence in energy decision-making, still what I would call, from any perspective, dismal scores. Look at those net scores, -33, -41, -50, -32. When we look at the trade-off between Canadians that think that we're doing a positive versus a negative job on building confidence in energy decision-making. And I don't know, I'm not sure if I was supposed to, I didn't ask Monica whether I was supposed to cheer people up, but there are obviously some numbers here that suggest that although there's been a lot of focus and although there's been effort, we haven't really seen for some of these measures the dial moving at all, especially when you think of the first question that we tested on, which there was some marginal movement. This was another new question that we've added to the group of what I'll say report card issues that we wanted to get an idea of where Canadians sat. And this had to do with building constructive partnerships with Indigenous peoples for energy projects. So, you know, I bring to your attention, you can see only 3% or less than 1 out of every 20 Canadians actually think that we're doing a very good job on building constructive partnerships. Another 14% said that we do a good job. But check out the negative numbers. You can see 41% of Canadians think that we do a poor or very poor job. So for all intents and purposes, what we're looking at is, at least by a margin of 2-to-1 and a net score of -23, Canadians not giving exceptionally positive scores on this particular measure. And it speaks to this being part of what I'll say the overall environment, a small e environment, when it comes to energy projects, and how there are very few Canadians that would really give us a thumbs up, right? Give the country a thumbs up when it comes to building constructive partnerships with Indigenous peoples for energy projects. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about cooperation. After all, we are in a federation. Canadians pride themselves on getting along. We believe that we're a pragmatic nation. We talk about brokerage politics. We talk about founding nations. We talk about truth and reconciliation and working together to find common solutions. And it's interesting when we test on decision making on climate change and energy projects separately, and to ask, hey, what type of job are we doing when it comes to federal and provincial governments, the two senior orders of government, working together and cooperating on these two things, climate change and energy projects. You can see that there isn't a lot of what I'll say positive numbers on either one of these measures, that only about 1 out of every 10, whether it has to do with decision making on climate change or decision making on an energy project, only about 1 out of every 10 score that federal and provincial governments working together cooperatively, very good or good. And you can see that Canadians are basically 5 times more likely to give a thumbs down rather than a thumbs up on the federal provincial cooperation front. Let's go down again. And this is a bit of a breakout by region. And you can see geographically there's a significant variation. Check out those numbers in Quebec and the numbers in the prairies. Only about 1 out of every 4 Quebecers actually give a negative score on federal provincial cooperation when it comes to energy projects. While if you swing over to the prairie provinces, that basically almost triples to 75.5% of residents that live in the prairie provinces that would score a very poor or poor score. Also, a pretty noticeable, not as dramatic, but a fairly noticeable distinction between men and women, where men are more likely to kind of harshly judge cooperation on energy decision making. And when you look at that same number, you can see relatively similar results when we're talking about decisions on climate change, where if you happen to be in Atlantic Canada or in the province of Quebec, you're much less likely to score a very poor or a poor score compared to if you live in the prairie provinces. Okay, so invite a pollster to a webinar and you're going to get a poll. We're going to do a poll. Raphael, can you? I don't know if I don't want to say that this is dramatic. Am I supposed to go like this? I think we need dramatic music though. I'd like to get the views of folks on the webinar. These are questions that we asked in the survey on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 means do not trust at all and 10 means completely trust. How much do you trust the courts to settle disputes on energy projects? Please submit your vote. I think I'd like Jeopardy. Do we have Jeopardy music? And then maybe Raphael can Raphael, can you throw the results up just for this question? I feel like speaking to the ether space or whatever. Here we go. So you can see here, although it's vertical, you can see pretty well a normal distribution curve, right? One person scored at a 1. Nobody scored a 10 out of 10. Oh boy, I think for all of you judicious type and judicial type groupies, might be a little bit disappointed that no one scored you perfect, but there is one person that at least you can see 5% scored a 9 out of 10, 16% an 8 out of 10. Let's keep that, Rafi, if we can keep that up on the screen if it's possible. But check out these numbers. And to put this into context, we've done a number of other surveys related to perceptions of the Supreme Court and the courts. And the courts traditionally actually poll very well when it comes to trust writ large. I actually found it quite striking, and you can see that the folks on the webinar actually agree with Canadians that Canadians actually gave the courts, when it comes to trust, to settle disputes over decisions on energy projects, a mean or an average of 5 on the 10-point scale. Scores are a little lower in the prairies. Women also are more likely to have confidence compared to men. But the fact of the matter is, I do not consider this. It's kind of like if the kids came home with a 5 out of 10, we'd say, I think it needs more work. Go back, get back to work, and move those numbers up. The other interesting thing, and I wanted to kind of show with you kind of the distribution, is that if you recall from some of our other polarization that we've done with our colleagues at Positive Energy, is that there tended to be polarization at both tails of the scale, but we don't really see that in this particular case. But you can see 5 being the most popular response, similar to the folks on the webinar, but not the same type of polarization on this that we've seen on other things. So Rafi, let's load up one more question. I love it when these things magically happen. Second question, it's a variation. The other one was on energy projects. Now this one is about trust in the courts to settle disputes over government decisions on climate change. Is it any better or is it worse? Tick tock, here come the numbers. I know that I have no authority as the chair of the advisory board, but I would like music next time we do this, please. Just to make it a little more of a show. Rafi, you got some numbers? Raphael? Oh, this is a little different. Check it out. So you can see in the previous question, actually 5, the 5 on the scale out of 10 scored highest. Here, a little more, a wee bit more positivity. So were Canadians a little more positive? Oh, sorry, before I do that, I've got to finish one more slide here. Why did people have the opinion on the previous slide? What were the drivers? So when we asked the score about energy projects, we asked them why they had that particular opinion. And what we did was we clustered them depending on where they landed on the scale. You can see for those low trust Canadians in the courts, they're more likely to cite the view that they thought that the courts might be influenced by politicians or biased. For the folks that had high trust, they're more likely to just say they generally have trust in the court system at 37, and the belief that the courts are impartial and independent. And those were the key drivers. But let's check out the numbers on the next question. Well, although the group scored a little higher in terms of confidence on climate change, actually you can see that the mean score among Canadians when it comes to decisions on this compared to energy projects is just a little bit lower at 4.9 out of 10. And Raphael, you can close the polling results now. But you know the key takeaway, and is that doesn't matter whether we're talking about disputes on climate change decisions, whether it comes to disputes on energy projects. I would hazard to say that the scores in terms of level of trust are not exceptionally strong. And when it comes to trusting the courts, what does this mean? This means that although the courts are definitely one of the avenues, it might suggest that there are probably other alternatives. I'm going to unpack that a little more in a minute. But we see a similar type of distribution in terms of the individual scores for on the 10-point scale as before, so not the same kind of polarization. But it's interesting when we look at kind of reasons for trust, we get some similar results. But the other thing that's quite interesting is that when we look at one of the factors, and I thought this was quite interesting, that there's, you can see 8% of Canadians, 12% of people that are neutral say, and these are open-ended questions where Canadians can say whatever they want, that it's not the court's jurisdiction to settle this. The government should be making decisions regarding climate change, not the courts. And I think this is just an example on how there are some Canadians out there that, and it's a minority view, but it's still out there, that when they think about these disputes, the first choice, at least for a little less than 1 out of every 10 Canadians, when it comes to, for example, settling disputes on climate change, the first choice would be alternatives to the courts, and to have the government lead, but also to consult stakeholders and to move things forward on that front. So this is my last slide before I throw it back over to Monica for our chit chat. But key takeaways, I'm not going to read this because this will be on the Positive Energy website. Confidence in decision making when it comes to energy and environmental policies still has a lot of room for improvement. That Canadians do not give positive scores when it comes to cooperation between federal and provincial levels of government on both climate issues and also energy projects. That the courts do not score exceptionally strongly when it comes to trust in settling disputes, and that those geographic, those regional differences that we've seen in our polling continue to persist. So maybe the last comment that I'll make is Canadians are still very engaged on the whole intersection of environmental energy policy. And it's like, do a better job, got to ramp those numbers up. And I don't want to say back to the drawing board, but there's more work that needs to be done in order to build a greater level of confidence in outcomes where Canadians can see that their views are represented and that we achieve those aspirational objectives when it comes to environmental and energy policy together. So Monica, back over to you, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Terrific, Nick. That was great, and I promise we'll get you music next time, so not to worry. So I encourage people to start typing their questions into the Q&A in the chat. Nick, I wanted to just pick up on a couple of things from those findings, which are really interesting and also kind of discouraging, I guess. So for an initiative called Positive Energy, it's okay, so what's the positive spin here? So a question for you, many of those questions, there were a lot of people, like the performance questions, there was a lot of people in that sort of Canada's doing an average job, like about a third of people in the middle. So, how should we be understanding that? Is that, are those the folks who perhaps are more open to being swayed one way or the other? Is that a place to look for, for positive for the future? And then related to that, is like, so what would be a good score? What should governments be aiming for here? Because, the one question where we saw change over time was the question on having environmental policies that align with the views of Canadians. And I think you're right, Nick, that, in 2015, it was the tail end of the Harper administration. And then we've come into a Liberal government since that time, and we clearly saw a small trend, a slow trend in those numbers. But I suspect if you were, a member of the Liberal government, you would say, "Holy cow! Look at all the stuff we did on climate change, and this is all we get for it in terms of improvement in the score." So, like, what should governments be looking for here by way of what's a good score, and what should we make of the all the folks who are rating governments in that average category?
So I see, Monica, what I see is that first question where there was a marginal improvement over time is a bit of a leading indicator. Like, let's face it, if people don't think that what they want aligns with what the government policy of the day is, they're gonna give a thumbs down, right? Because they're gonna say this is not what we want. The other thing is that I think the first step would be to have more people have a positive rather than a negative view, setting aside kind of what I'll say the mushy middle that you correctly put your finger on. And I think the other thing is that I would say that one question about having a long-term vision is probably critical. And for average Canadians, that's all they want is, in a way, it's kind of like many other stakeholders in this space. They want some sort of certainty. How can they plan? How do things move forward towards towards a long-term objective? And I think one of the challenges that we have is that for a lot of Canadians, some of these objectives are so far into the future that it's hard really to get motivated to think that we're doing a good job, because Canadians, and from the other research that we've done, Canadians, even in the pandemic, are still more likely to be climate ambitious. And the question is, how do we feed that climate ambition? Mm-hmm. The one thing that we have to remember, and this is my last point, is that the prairie provinces remain an outlier. And governments and stakeholders have to decide what is the real strategy for the prairie provinces. Like, if we live in a federation and we have a respect for minority views, we have to have a strategy for the prairies on environment and energy that moves the needle, because you can't take a quarter of the country who are not aligned with whatever the path forward is and move the national number numerically. It's just hard to do. Mm-hmm. So, I would say we need to have a long-term strategy. We need to remind people that whatever policies and solutions move forward align with what Canadians want. And we need like a real discussion in the prairies on how environment and energy can reconcile itself for a future that includes the prairie provinces.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, makes lots of sense, Nick, and well put in terms of pulling on some of the other polling work that we've done that really does underscore that there's ambition there on climate. So we've got a question here. I'm hoping I'm understanding this correctly. So the question is, can you attribute, or to what can you attribute the plateau in trust/confidence in climate change action? And can you make any comparison with other countries? Is that something you can speak to, Nick, given your other work and knowledge of the global context?
Yeah, and I think a lot of this has to do with, okay, Monica, here's a question for you. What's the good news on energy and the environment?
I think there's lots of great news. I mean, I head up positive energy, so I could, give you a pretty long list, but you're right. You don't see that coming forward that often, do you?
Yeah, exactly. So, we see big ambitions on environmental policy, especially from the federal Liberal government. But when we think of good news, that's all we hear. And maybe the media is partly to blame. That's all we hear are bad news. That's all we hear are bad news. That, for the energy market that we have problems getting it to market, that the federal government might not be agreeing with different provincial governments, and it's like continuous bickering, and it's hard to have a sense of things moving forward in a positive sense. Why don't we take another country like Germany, for example, where I have seen polling in Germany, or even a country like France. And when we look at Germany and France, there's generally, I won't use the word a consensus, but majority views on the direction, and then governments that are incrementally moving towards a particular direction. And the thing is that both of those countries are kind of moving forward in terms of their environmental policy in a way that does not undermine the viability of jobs, which is what people really care about. And we're seeing even countries like the United Kingdom and the Johnson government be more ambitious when it comes to climate change. Maybe those are unfair comparators because Canada is, an energy superpower, and it's a big part of our economy. And that energy is a big part of those other economies, but not to the same extent as Canada. So perhaps we should be asking our question is, how does an energy superpower reconcile being an energy superpower with having real and important aspirations on the environmental front? And I'm not sure we've squared the circle on that one.
Oh, no, I couldn't agree with you more, Nick. And I mean, as you know, this current 3-year phase of positive energy is pretty much about exactly that question. How does Canada, as a resource intense, with a large energy reserve and a federation on top of it, where, as we know, there's very, highly decentralized and divided jurisdiction over energy in the country. How does it chart a path forward for energy and climate change that secures confidence of not just the public, but investors, of governments themselves, of individual citizens, communities, and the like? And I take your point too in terms of the positive things. The fact that Canada has a carbon tax that applies across the country is a huge accomplishment. The fact that the country was able to get to that, and I think sometimes those sorts of positive moves forward, we don't necessarily take the occasion to congratulate ourselves, as it were, for those. So I'm going to jump into a couple other questions here. So I've got a question from Bob Walker. He asks, do you have data to indicate whether there is or is not alignment between Canadians' views on these matters and their political party alignment? Stated another way, is political polarization a significant factor?
So political polarization is a significant factor, but Bob, as you know from what we always learned in high school and university when we studied politics, that we are a country of regions. And, I guess the question that you might want to ask is it coincidental that the Conservatives are the strongest in the prairies and have always been the strongest in the prairie provinces, and that this happens to align with where our energy heartland is? So to the point where, the place where the energy economy is really home aligns coincidentally, concurrently, whatever you want to call it, with where the Conservatives happen to be extremely strong, points to that particular polarization comment. But the thing is that I would hazard to say that when you're looking at Conservative voters, they're interested in the economy, more likely to be interested in the economy than voters for some of the other parties. So, maybe the question is, maybe we're not doing a good enough job at connecting our environmental aspirations to economic growth and prosperity in a meaningful way. And, the thing is that, whenever governments have these types of programs, that's all people think about is, what does this mean to me? And perhaps we're in a place where if we wanted to break down some of that polarization, we just have to do a better job at showing at how a green economy can, in a meaningful and real way, convert into jobs on the ground, as opposed to jobs in the future.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think also articulating, well, what is the place of Canada's oil and gas sector in that future in a way that people see as inclusive. And you point to the prairies, Nick, but it's also, look at what's going on in Newfoundland and Labrador right now, right? This is, I think it's coming home potentially quite powerfully for folks in the next little while, and we'll see where things go in terms of government decision making. So we've got another question here from Peter McKinnon, which kind of aligns with what you were just saying, Nick. So it says, given the data as presented, what is its value to policymaking? Because that's, I think, where we want to go with this, right? What are the recommendations for policymakers? What is its value to policymaking at both the federal and provincial level? Or does it have any value as a signal of Canada's attitude and understanding of the issues at hand?
How about this? Let's stop blaming each other and get to work to finding positive solutions. And I think for average Canadians, what they see are governments disagreeing and blaming other levels of government, whether the federal government or different provinces, or back and forth. And we should just have. It's kind of like the steps to finding a solution. The first step is to recognize that we have a problem. Mm-hmm. And the second step is to take responsibility for our actions. And I think that when we look at federal and provincial cooperation, what's clear is that Canadians are not enthusiastic in terms or positive on how our federation is working when it comes to either climate change policies or energy project policies. All governments should take responsibility for this. And then, we should just, I think, just start to find solutions. The other thing is that in the research that we've done in general, people are more likely to believe incremental steps forward as opposed to the big, magnificent solution of a generation. So perhaps one of the things that our provincial governments can do with each other and also with the federal government is to think of incremental steps forward, to perhaps not be overly ambitious, but to put something in the window so that people can feel confident that things are moving in the right direction, and that actually some headway is being done.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I know we've got Dwayne Bratt, I think is an attendee here today. He's also a member of the Positive Energy Research Team. Later this week, he's going to be presenting a study that he authored around federal-provincial relations over energy. And, and this is precisely some of the points that he makes in that study. I mean, once in a while, you get those windows of opportunity. The Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change would be a great illustration of that. We now have a carbon tax as a result of that. But, in the interim, in the meantime, when you don't have those windows of opportunity, it can mean that, that incremental change that sometimes is not just about, the great grand bargain. It can be about, smaller agreements, even between provinces or with a smaller number of provinces in the federal government and the like. So I think you're quite right, Nick, in terms of that positive ongoing progress, but perhaps, might not be as grand and as fast as some would like, but at the same time is able to move the country forward on these issues. So I want to get to the question around the courts, and we have a question here from somebody on that front. I found those results so surprising. Again, I don't have the benefit, Nick, as you do, to kind of know what some of the other research that you've done in that context have been. But when I think about some of the big controversies over energy and climate that have found their way into the courts, whether it's the carbon tax or the Trans Mountain Pipeline, or other issues, I have not seen very frequently, if at all, governments throwing the courts under the bus, right? What you see instead is political leaders saying the courts have spoken, we will do what we've been told to do, whether it's, on the carbon tax or on consultation with Indigenous peoples or what have you. So I found that really surprising. And I would just love to hear if there's any thoughts from you, Nick, around why you think Canadians would hold this view, what's going on there? And then the question that's being asked by one of our attendees is, how could the perception of interference of governments in the courts among Canadians be changed?
So, Monica, what I find interesting, I'll tell you, as a researcher, I'm always very humbled at the views of Canadians because they're complex and there's nuance. Yeah. And when I saw the number, I had the same reaction as you did, because most of the polling that we see on the courts, it's usually like an 8 out of 10. It's a 9 out of 10. The courts are at, when you look at any of these trust scores, the courts are always at the top of the list. Who do you trust? What institutions do you trust? But to score a 5 out of 10 on this specific issue, so this isn't about the courts writ large, to me suggests that Canadians understand that this is complex. It's not as easy as kicking it over to the courts and having a solution that respects and captures the views of a diversity of Canadians. And the other thing is I would hazard to say that if there was the view that the courts had really done a great job at kind of getting us through some of these disputes, that the scores would have been higher. And there's probably a sense that the courts don't really settle anything, because even when there's a court decision, there's a significant stakeholders on whatever side of the ledger that you want to pick that are disappointed. So what does this mean? This means that, I think at least, that on these specific issues, government should not be too fast to kick it over to the courts. That they need to do their work in dialogue, engagement, having those tough discussions in order to try to find solutions. And I think if we were to do kind of more research on this, I wouldn't be surprised if Canadians said, yes, the courts should be an option, but we shouldn't be in a hurry to go to the courts. We should try to figure it out within our federation, where we kind of look at what the aspirations of Canadians are, respect the diversity of stakeholders that are out there, and try to broker some type of solution. So, you know, I think one of the challenges that we have is that the courts are a quick and neat and tidy political solution, but whether it actually leads to a solution is a completely different story. So I think that would be the key takeaway from Canadians, is like, yes, the courts, but we shouldn't be too enthusiastic about quickly moving to the courts. Let's go back, because, and you know, you saw that there are Canadians out there, and they're not public policy experts, but still about 10%, a little less than 10% of Canadians who are not public policy experts say the courts are not the place to settle these disputes. Yeah. They need to be settled back in the community, between regions, between provinces, and between all the different levels of government.
Yeah, no, I take that explanation as quite persuasive, Nick, you know, and it really underscores, I think, for me, which also gets back to some of the other questions in this latest round of survey work, that Canadians are looking for consensus building. They are looking for, you know, governments and others to do the work that needs to be done to get to, you know, consensus, at least, you know, again, depending on how we might define that, but to the point that it doesn't find its way into the courts. Very, very interesting. So we've got a couple of questions here around demographic, kind of breaking things out demographically. And so I'm just going to roll the two of them up so you can respond, Nick. So one of them is, did you also look at whether Black, Indigenous, and people of color have differing opinions from the average Canadian? And then the other one is, in fact, it was asked by the same person, did you get a chance to ask the question on building constructive partnerships with Indigenous peoples in areas that have a large concentration of Indigenous people, like in the territories? And if so, what was their overall opinion?
So this is where, as a research Monica, and you'll appreciate this, that I always have to talk about the limitations of the research. And it's not just the technical margin of error, but you know, one of the survey is a national survey. We know that Indigenous peoples make up about 5% of the population, which means that the subsample to report on that is quite small. But what we do know from some of the other work that Positive Energy has done is that you know, the best way to unpack those things is to do what I'll say bespoke projects on you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color, among those stakeholders. So we don't, the sample is not robust enough for us to make generalizations to the populace. But you know, my general sense, and I'd like to say full disclosure, we do work for the Assembly of First Nations, right? So we do that. My sense in the research that we've done in the Indigenous space is that Indigenous peoples, especially young Indigenous peoples, are much more impatient than previous generations and their parents. That they don't see, they don't see why we should be waiting to move forward on any of these things. And they want, you know, young Indigenous peoples, in the research that we've done, want action, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, the interesting twist is that young Canadians want action too on a lot of these things. So, but you know, I would say that those scores for those groups of individuals who are part of that kind of marginalized population that is extremely important, generally they would be even more negative, but I just can't make a generalization because the subsamples are smaller.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it really does raise the question of, sort of what other research should we do? And I think that, there's some interesting implicit suggestions in there for us. I think the other thing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Nick, I would love to actually ask Canadians why to all of the scorecard questions. Why do you hold up? Like we did for the courts, and I'm so glad that we did because those answers were extremely informative. But I'd love to ask why, because my spidey sense says that we might get some really different answers, even for people who said the same thing. So for those who said, government's doing a terrible job, they might actually answer with diametrically opposed reasons as to why, and those could differ, regionally and the like. Thoughts from you, Nick, on how we might push that and peel the onion a little bit there?
Yeah, no, I think that would be that'd be a great extra dimension to ask. And I'll tell you why, Monica, I like asking the why question, because many times the why question helps inform us as to what a solution is. And it doesn't have to be a majority opinion. It's kind of like the response where people said that the courts are not the best place to settle dispute. They're not public policy experts, but you see that and it's kind of like, okay, so there's a gem of insight from average Canadians that probably has broader application, where I bet your bottom dollar that if someone who had that opinion told someone else, they go, yeah, you're right. Like, why do we need to settle these in the courts? The courts should be the last thing. Stakeholders should be forced to work together. We need to do, better homework. We need to do a better job. We need to do a better job at engaging stakeholders. We need to do a better job at respecting a diversity of stakeholders. And so I think to your point, it would be great to have some open-ended follow-up questions in order to kind of harvest some of those ideas on what the paths forward are. Because it's like any kind of survey. That's all it takes is one idea that is a gem, even if it's not a majority opinion. And then if you kind of start sharing that, it can have a material impact on things.
Great. Well, we've got time for just a few more questions. So if you have additional questions, please pop them in the chat, or in the Q&A, I should say. So here's another one for you, Nick, that's going a little beyond what we're talking about today, but I think it's super relevant. Do you think the Biden administration, its policies around climate change and U.S. opinion on these issues will impact how Canadians perceive Canadian policy, positively, negatively? Thoughts?
Cynthia, 100%, I'm with you on this. And the thing is that not just on energy and climate issues, but on a full range of issues, the benchmark that Canadians measure themselves, for most Canadians, is actually the United States. When they believe that we're doing a better job, we feel good. When they think that we're doing a job as good as the Americans, we feel okay. If they feel that we are lagging or trailing the Americans on some of these really big issues like income inequality and healthcare and stuff like that, education, then people get upset. And one thing that we have seen, Cynthia, is a Biden administration that is very clearly and significantly staking out a position on environmental issues. Many of these have a material impact on Canada directly. And I think what we have to have on the radar, so to speak, is if there's any sense that the Americans are making more progress on climate ambition or reconciling the energy sector with jobs. And let's face it, America's an energy superpower now, right? Like it's a much more different place than it was years ago, and they're probably more comparable to us on some dimensions. So I think if they see the Americans becoming more ambitious on a green economy, on the environment, on jobs, hydrogen power, all that kind of stuff, it'll put pressure on whoever the government of the day is, because our self-image of ourselves is that we're better than the Americans when it comes to environmental policy, especially. And the thing is I don't think there are very many Canadians who would think that the Americans have foregone their commitment to prosperity and jobs, and they know that Americans are still committed to those things, while still trying to move forward on the environment.
Great. Thanks, Nick. So last question for you, and I'm going to take the prerogative as chair here and ask one for me. So what when you look at all of these findings, what does this suggest to you in terms of positive energy and the kind of work that we can and should be doing?
I think the work that positive energy does in terms of finding real world solutions, and let's face it, I hope, Monica, you don't get upset at this, but a lot of the work that's done by positive energy is not glamorous or sexy, but it's meat and potato solutions that are practical. And that goes to, we talked about this earlier, incremental, real world solutions that can have a real world impact. And I think the implications of this research is to say, let's stop going at 50,000 feet and having the big press conference and the massively ambitious kind of solution. I think we have to get back to the ground. We have to reground our discussion on climate and energy and have a real heart-to-heart, and then to start to put those building blocks together, those building blocks that all the researchers at Positive Energy have been articulating. And it might not be the most exciting, but it's good for you. It'll be good for Canada, and it'll be good for public policymakers.
That is great. Thank you, Nick. Now is the moment. If we were in person, I'd be asking everybody to join me in a grand round of applause, and I'm sure it would be thunderous. I really do want to take a moment, though, to thank you, Nick, for your longstanding support of Positive Energy. You've been with us since the very beginning. And thank you so much for giving so generously over the last number of years of your time, your expertise, your advice. Positive Energy is much the better for it. Thank you, Nick. So greatly appreciated.
It's been fun too.
Great. Well, before closing off, I want to just give everyone a sneak peek of what's coming up. So tomorrow's session is going to be focusing in on policymakers, regulators, and the courts. Maybe not the most exciting, Nick, but we find it absolutely stimulating over here at Positive Energy. And the questions we're asking are, who decides what, when, and how? So we'll have presentations by Mike Cleland, member of our team, on a major positive energy project focused on the evolution of regulatory independence and effectiveness over time. Actually very crucial for net zero by 2050, as it turns out, for those who tune in tomorrow. And we also have a presentation from Roland Harrison, who undertook a really fascinating case study of TC Energy's 2021 NGTL pipeline expansion project, looking specifically at the role of the federal cabinet in that decision. Tabitha Bull from the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business is our discussant for tomorrow. Wednesday, we're looking at federalism. Dwayne Bratt, I mentioned earlier, he's got his study on federal-provincial relations over energy and climate change. We have Andrew Pickford, who's undertaking a comparative study for us of liquefied natural gas final investment decisions in British Columbia and Western Australia. We have Shannon Joseph from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers as our discussant for that session, and a special presentation at that session from our arts consultant, that was hard to say, Cameron Cross. Thursday, the final day of the conference, we've got over the noon hour again, our session focuses in on new imperatives in regulatory decision making. So looking at new technologies, at public engagement, at policy regulatory relations, all of these imperatives that are impinging increasingly on regulators. We have presentations from team members James Donald and Patricia Larkin, with discussant Robert Hornung from the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. And finally, I'd like to close by thanking Positive Energy staff members Dr. Marissa Beck, Brendan Frank, and Raphael Desordi for planning and organizing the conference. Marissa, Brendan, Raphael, we could not do it without you. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for tuning in today. We hope to see you tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday. Bye for now.